On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event with Michael Pollan, discussing his book, Cooked, A Natural History of Transformation. Michael is the author of 6 previous books, including Food Rules, In Defense of Food, The Omnivore's Dilemma, and The Botany of Desire, all New York Times bestsellers. A longtime contributor to the New York Times, he's also the Knight Professor of Journalism at Berkeley. In Cooked, Michael guides readers through the previously uncharted territory of his own kitchen, where he discovers the enduring power of the 4 classical elements, fire, water, air, and earth, to transform the stuff of nature into delicious things to eat and drink. Each section of Cooked tracks his effort to master a single classic recipe using one of these 4 elements. The Boston Globe raved that Cooked is nothing short of important, possibly life-altering reading for every living, breathing human being. Please join me in welcoming Michael Pollan.
So thank you all for coming. I'm looking forward to hearing from you too. And after I talk and read for a little bit, I'd love to hear your questions about this book or anything else that I might know something about. I'm going to do something a little different tonight, and that is to not dwell so much on the argument of the book, which I'm hoping some of you are kind of familiar with. The argument's pretty simple, that there are a lot of good reasons to cook, and that the decline in home cooking has gotten us into lots of trouble from a health point of view, from an environmental point of view, and I think almost, from a spiritual point of view. And that it's important work. But when you hear that, which is kind of what reviewers dwell on, it sounds like homework. It sounds like, the kinds of lectures that somebody might deliver from this podium. And the book is, although it has some of that, it's also an adventure story. It's a story of my education. And what I did to learn how to cook and bake and ferment and pickle and brew was apprentice myself to some masters and had a fantastic time. I don't think I've ever had so much fun when I was ostensibly working as I had doing this book. So I want to give you a little more. I'm going to read a short passage from each of the 4 sections and knit it together and explain why I did what I did and introduce you to some of the characters in the book and some of the stories. So why a book on cooking? Well, it really grew out of this journey I've been on now for almost 15 years about writing about our food system. I began at the farm end, and those of you who know Omnivore's Dilemma, it's very much about where the food comes from and how it comes out of the earth and ends up on our plates. And, the more I worked on that and learned about the problems of industrial agriculture, most of which trace to a single problem, which is growing too much of the same thing in these big monocultures, the more I realized that was being driven by we were complicit in that process because we were outsourcing the preparation of our food to large industrial corporations. Fast food ones in particular. The reason there are feedlots is because we're eating from McDonald's. And the reason that you have 35,000-acre potato farms in Idaho that are very dependent on lots of pesticide is because we want those perfect long French fries, which can only be made from one kind of potato that has to be given lots of chemicals to look good. So that stuck in the back of my mind that our own habits were helping to create this landscape. And as much as we might deplore it from our easy position here as non-farmers, we were complicit. And then on the other side, after Omnivore's Dilemma, I kind of leapt ahead to the far other end of the food chain, to the body end, and looked at what happens when we eat food, what are the links between diet and health. And last time I was here, some of you may have heard me, I talked a lot about nutrients and how our obsession with good and bad nutrients was really confusing us about food, and that food was really not just about nutrients. And as I kind of disassembled the consensus around nutrition science, it occurred to me then that one of the most important markers for a healthy diet was not whether it contained lots of good nutrients and avoided bad nutrients, but how was it prepared? How was it processed? Was it cooked by a human being or an industrial corporation? And the best marker for a healthy diet was, in fact, one cooked by human beings. So between those two things, I kind of came to the realization that cooking, this part of the food chain that seemed the most obvious and hidden in plain sight, deserved a book of its own. But in the process of writing it, I really just wanted to kind of do a deep dive into the meaning of cooking. This is not a book with, it has 4 recipes, only 4. It won't tell you how to, it doesn't have all those 30-minute recipes you want. And I can recommend books that will give you that. But I wanted to get to the deeper essence of cooking as an engagement with the natural world, which it is. It's a very profound engagement with nature, not to mention with the people that we feed. So as I looked at, kind of tried to reduce cooking to its fundamentals, I realized that it was a process of transformation of nature into culture, of raw into cooked, and it was also it could be divided into 4 fundamental big transformations. And that these just so happen, and this was my wife's insight, Judith, who said, hey, that sounds like the classical elements. And she was right. It sort of matched up. Fire, water, air, and earth. And I'll explain how what air is doing in our food. It's not a chapter on seltzer. It's about bread. And earth is about bacteria and fermentation. And that, I don't know why it lined up that well, but it lined up that well, and that was kind of nice. And I kind of worked I kind of try to master the 4 transformations. Now, I started out with fire, because that's where cooking started. And in fact, I learned a lot from someone who lives in this town, Richard Wrangham, who's an anthropologist and primatologist at Harvard, who's proposed something called the cooking hypothesis, which is a very intriguing idea. It is still a hypothesis, but a very persuasive one, that the kind of missing explanation for how we departed from the other apes and got our big brains and developed language and self-consciousness and all these kind of things can be traced to the one evolutionary development, and that was the discovery of cooked food. Because when you cook food, you suddenly, which we're the only animal that does this, with one little exception, if you remind me, I'll tell you later. But when you cook food, you're essentially externalizing part of the digestive process when you put heat on food. So your body doesn't have to use so much energy breaking it down. Not to mention it tastes better, it's safer because you've killed off certain microbes, and you have access to foods that other animals can't make use of, like poisonous tubers of various kinds, which are only edible after you cook them. So this was a huge boon for our species, and it happened 2 million years ago, and he argues that that is when you see the human brain get a lot bigger and the human gut, no longer needed for all this digestive work, shrinks. And it did something else really important for us too, which is it relieved us of the considerable work of chewing. And if you look at primates our size, you will find that they spend half their waking hours in the act of chewing. Very hard to get much done if you're spending that much time chewing. Very hard to have a culture, civilization, baseball, all sorts of things don't happen if you're spending 6 hours a day chomping. So that was very important too. And then cooking also gave us this amazing institution, which we alone have, the meal. Because cooking is a cooperative activity. Someone has to mind the fire, someone has to prepare the meat or whatever it is, and then you tend to gather around the fire, and then you need all these rules to govern what happens there. You have to learn how to share, take turns, be patient while it's cooking. I mean, think about it. The danger when you're cooking this incredibly wonderful carcass of whatever it is that the toughest, hungriest, greediest person could get it if you didn't have a lot of rules to govern that activity. So you have the beginning of civilization around the cook fire. And so I went looking for what is the modern equivalent of that. What is the most primal cooking with fire? And I found it in eastern North Carolina, where they still practice whole hog barbecue. And the recipe is really simple. Pig, wood fire, thyme. Little salt. That's it. And it's not, barbecue elsewhere in the South is very different. And in fact, the people in eastern North Carolina would not deign to call what happens in western North Carolina barbecue, because they only cook pork shoulders and they have a sauce with ketchup in it, and in South Carolina they have a sauce with mustard in it, and there's this balkanized republic of barbecue down there. But I threw my lot with the guys in eastern North Carolina. And I went out to Aden because I'd heard about a place called the Skylight Inn that hadn't really changed the way they do barbecue for a very long time. And I want to introduce you to Samuel, the guy who owns this place, Skylight Inn. And this place is really in the middle of nowhere. It's about an hour off of 95, but worth a detour. And so they have this very funny-looking restaurant, and it's got a Capitol dome on top, which makes no sense at all. But and it's called the Skylight Inn. It doesn't have a skylight. That makes no sense at all. But they were named by National Geographic like 20 years ago the capital of barbecue, so they put a Capitol dome on top. And in the back are these two cinder block cottages at no particular angle to the main building, and that's where they cook because they've had so many fires that they don't want the restaurant touching the pit house, the pit room. And Samuel, the owner of the place, said, "Let me take you around to what he calls the vestibule of hell." The pit room was, in fact, an infernal chamber, and not a place likely to stimulate an appetite for cooked pig in many people. The residues of fires, big and small, were everywhere, blackening the bricks, charring the ceiling, puckering the plywood walls. While Samuel and I talked, I could see over his left shoulder a spectral presence emerging out of the smoke. The whole room is just full of smoke. It's really an oven, a low-temperature oven. The figure of a slightly bent black man slowly pushing a wheelbarrow topped with a sheet of blood-stained plywood on which the splayed pink carcass of a hog precariously balanced. I could see the hog's eyeless head bobbing slightly on the lip of the wheelbarrow, and as it drew closer, the face of the man carefully inching it forward. It was deeply lined, leathery, and missing several teeth. Samuel introduced me to James Henry Howell, the Skylight Inn's longtime pitmaster, but Howell made it instantly clear he would be leaving all the talking to the Joneses, who own the place. Back and forth across the pit room, Mr. Howell slowly wheeled his hogs, melting into the haze to fetch another carcass from the walk-in cooler, then emerging again with his load, which he would tenderly tip onto the iron grates. Both sides of the room are lined with these iron grates, and then there's a fire burning in one corner, and it's a giant fire with huge logs, and the grate is made from truck axles. That's how big this fireplace is. And they shovel the coals after they burn down under the pigs in an outline of the pig's body. It looks like almost a police recreation of a pig. Howell worked slowly and deliberately, and when he was done putting the hogs on, he had created an arresting tableau, a smoke-dimmed conga line of splayed pink carcasses laid out skin side up and snout to butt. The interior of the cookhouse now looked like a bunk room, the sleeping hogs bedded down for the night. Of all the animals we eat, none resembles us more closely than the hog. Each the size of a grown man, hairless and pink, its mouth set in what looks very much like a sly smile, the half-dozen pigs laid out in this smoky crypt made me think of many things, but definitely not lunch or dinner. So I watched the beginning of the process, and it takes overnight. It's very slow, very low temperature cooking, and that's really the key to good barbecue. And one of the lessons I took away is I grill like most people do in the North, which is really fast, really hot. And that to the extent you slowed things down dramatically, amazing things happen to meat. So anyway, but then it was time for me to have a sandwich. And I'll just tell you a little bit about that. I wish I could share it with you. It only costs $2.75. Barbecue is a very democratic food. As I waited at the counter to place my order, a barbecue sandwich and an iced tea, I watched Jeff chop and season barbecue. Seasoning consists of salt and pepper, a generous splash of apple cider vinegar, and a few dashes of Texas Pride, a red-hot sauce that curiously is made in North Carolina. I guess Texas is a superior signifier for spicy and authentic. Wielding a cleaver in each hand, Jeff roughly chops big chunks of meat from different parts of the hog. This is what makes whole hog barbecue special. It's a mix of all the different cuts. See, you got your ham, which is lean meat, but can be a little dry, and then you got your shoulder, which is greasier, but more tender and moist, and of course there's the belly meat, which is probably your juiciest cut. Of course, there's always some nice bark here and there. Bark in barbecue terminology is barbecue terminology for the singed outer edges of the meat. And then you got your skin, which lends some nice salty crunch. Chop them all together, not too fine, throw some seasoning on there and mix it in good, and that's it right there, whole hog barbecue sandwich. So this was barbecue. After all my years of misusing this word to think it was just cooking outdoors over a charcoal or propane, but no. Right away, I realized I had never before tasted the real thing, and I was converted. This was easily one of the tastiest, most succulent meat dishes I'd ever eaten, and certainly the most rewarding $2.75 I'd ever invested in a sandwich. Barbecue. My first bite made me realize with a cringing pang that as a northerner, I'd already spent more than half my life as a serial abuser of that peculiar word, which is to say as a backyard blackener of steaks and chops over too hot fires, over flames, with a pitiable dependence on sauce. These guys are not into sauce. Even before I had finished my sandwich, I resolved to figure out how to make barbecue like this, to try to redeem that noble word at home. There was so much going on in that sandwich. It wasn't just all the different cuts of pork, which kept things interesting bite after bite, but all that wood and time and tradition. This was the way barbecue had been prepared for generations here in eastern North Carolina, and having done my reading in barbecue history, I could appreciate what an accurate reflection of this place and its past this sandwich offered. If a sandwich can be said to have terroir, that quality of place that the French believe finds its way into the best wines and cheeses, this sandwich had it, a sense of place and history you could taste. So that was the beginning of my barbecue adventure, and exploring fire and what happens, and going all the way back, really. The barbecue pitmasters, they don't know this, but all of them, but they're descendants of the priests in Greek religion who perform ritual sacrifice, and they have the same kind of self-dramatizing status. And indeed, all of us men, when we're behind the barbecue grill, are drawing on the same cultural capital. Complicating things, by and large, because actually barbecues are really simple. But men are good at complicating things. So after barbecue, I looked at water. And cooking with water is my shorthand for cooking with liquid in pots. It's completely different than cooking over a direct fire and represents a tremendous gain in power for us. It doesn't happen until about 10,000 years ago. You don't have cooking in pots. Remember, fire starts about 2 million years ago, so you got a long time before you start cooking in pots. It awaits a few things. It awaits the discovery or the invention of fired clay that you can put over a fire, or that can withstand putting a hot ball or rock. That was the other way to do it. You'd heat up a rock in a fire and drop it into a bowl and boil it that way. But when you have this new thing, many things become possible. For one thing, it's no coincidence that it arises around the beginning of agriculture, because this is when you're growing a lot of grain, which is to say when we began eating lots of seeds. Seeds are a real problem. They have to be ground or boiled to be edible. And you need the pot in order to do that. So it's arguable that we could have had agriculture without this technology for preparing gruels and porridges and later bread. The other thing the pot lets you do, though, is first, there's no waste. You're no longer dripping fat, which has all the, most of the flavor and a lot of the calories, onto the fire. You're saving everything. It's very economical cooking. You're also softening food. So suddenly you can keep old people alive longer. They don't need to chew anymore. You can make soup. And you can wean babies earlier, too, which is, is a boon in many ways also. So there are many advantages to cooking this way. And this is the section of the book where I really talk about home cooking. And at the beginning of this section, I have a little discussion of, I found all these dishes really begin the same way. It's kind of remarkable in many different cultures. And that is with the chopping of onions, which is the part of cooking that kept me from cooking most of the time. So I had to do some work on that. Is there anyone alive who actually enjoys chopping onions? Oh, there may be some Buddhists who give themselves over to the work, even to the tears, on the principle that when chopping onions, just chop onions, i.e. don't resist or complain about it, just be there in the moment doing it. But most of us are not so zen. When chopping onions, we bitch about chopping onions. It's no wonder everyday home cooking is in trouble now that there are so many cheap and easy ways to outsource the work, chopping included. Prepare dinner yourself from scratch, and more often than not, the recipe will begin with a dice of onions, and the onions, more often than not, will resist. In fact, there are few things that we eat that defend themselves against us quite as effectively as an onion. From the onion's point of view, the blade of your knife might as well be the incisor of a rodent, a mortal threat that elicits a chemical reaction cleverly designed to thwart the would-be attacker. Hoping to make chopping onions more interesting, if not more pleasant, I looked into the onion strategy and was surprised to learn that the plant does not mount its defense until the moment tooth or blade pierce cell wall. See, if you could shrink yourself down to the size of a mitochondria or nucleus and swim around inside an undamaged onion cell, you would find the environment surprisingly benign, the taste of the ambient fluid sweet, certainly no cause for tears. Although there are 4 different defense molecules floating all around you, you probably would not notice them. What you might notice floating around you are these vacuoles, little balloon-like storage structures that in onions contain an enzyme that functions as a kind of trigger. When a blade or tooth breaks open a vacuole, the enzyme escapes, locates one of the defensive molecules, and breaks it in 2. The volatile new chemical compound that results are what give raw onions their powerfully sulfurous and irritating smell. One of the most volatile of these compounds is aptly called the lacrimator, the tear maker. It escapes from the damaged cell into the air and proceeds to attack the nerve endings in a mammal's eyes and nasal passages before breaking down into a noxious cocktail of sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and sulfuric acid. A very effective molecular bomb is how Harold McGee describes it. Indeed, imagine a food plant that greets its eaters with a hit of sulfuric acid and tear gas. That is the onion. And in the course of that chapter, where I apprenticed myself to a restaurant chef, a Chez Panisse chef, and learned all about braises and stews and just knife skills and what you do in a kitchen, most of which I didn't know how to do, I gradually got on better terms with onions. And Samin, my teacher, Samin Nosrat is her name, and she's got a book coming out next year that I think is going to be really good. She said that the key to cooking well was patience, practice, and presence. It's a very kind of yoga idea. The practice you kind of understand. You've got to do it more to get good at it. The patience is don't rush things in the kitchen, especially the sautéing of onions. Most of us only give them, because the recipes tell us wrongly. By the way, all recipes are artificially sped up because the editors say, you've got to make this in 30 minutes. Nobody's going to sit for an hour-long recipe. So they just lie, and they tell you, sauté the onions for 10 minutes. Try sautéing them for 20 or 30, and you'll see how much better your food becomes. Because you need to get all that sulfuric acid out of them and sweeten them, but you do it slowly, and everything just has this whole other dimension. So patience, very, very important. And she said when she worked in the restaurant, there were all these macho guys, and they'd seen the Food Network shows, and they'd turn up the flames like this and sauté at too high a temperature. You know, she'd always go along and turn down their flames. So you see the male-women thing around fire is pronounced. And presence, really, really important. I think we all struggle with that, and that is that one of the reasons we don't cook is we keep thinking of other things we might be doing at the same time. There's mail to answer, email to answer, there's exercise that you're not doing, there's so many things you could do instead. And she kind of taught me by example that just letting yourself be in the kitchen and realize, I'm giving the next hour to this work, is one of the most liberating things you can do. We all struggle with time, it's true, but we find time for things we value and things that give us pleasure. And once you're not internally divided, and we all are, because cooking now is optional, okay? For the first time in human history, for people who weren't, the rich, cooking is optional. And so that's why we're internally divided. So she taught me a lot about presence and just being there. And I still struggle with that, but I find when I can give myself over, surrender to it, essentially, it's incredibly rewarding. And the food comes out better, too. So this book is not just about home cooking. I also did what I think of as extreme cooking, although it all used to be home cooking. And so there's a chapter on baking. And in a way, baking is what I enjoyed the most and find myself continuing to do more than I ever would have guessed. And I apprenticed myself to a man who I think might be the best baker in the country. Not that I've tried every loaf of bread in the country, although I would try. I don't have an issue with gluten. I'll defend gluten. If somebody wants to ask me about it later. But I know it's controversial. So Chad Robertson is a baker in San Francisco. He has a bakery called Tartine, and if you get to San Francisco anytime, you should go to his bakery around 5 o'clock in the afternoon when the loaves come out. It's not a typical bakery because he's a surfer, so he's on a slightly different schedule. He only breaks about, I don't know, a couple hundred loaves a day, and people actually call and reserve them in advance. But if you go early in the week, you can get one. And it really is spectacularly good bread. Has this amazing contrast of this leathery, hard-baked black exterior with this soft custardy crumb inside. It's really delicious. So I asked him if he could show me how to bake. And he was really generous. And one of the things I was concerned about was, I had to start a starter. This is sourdough baking. And you need a starter, which is a culture of bacteria and yeast that is what you use instead of commercial yeast. And the best breads are made with a sourdough starter. It doesn't mean they're sour, and his breads are not sour at all. So anyway, so I went to, and I spent several shifts with him in the restaurant and in the bakery. I was nervous I wanted to ask him for his starter, and I figured this was good stuff. But I didn't know the etiquette, whether you can ask a baker for their starter, and I figured it wasn't a good question. So I did the next best thing. I shook his hand a lot every time I had a chance. Chad Robertson looks less like a baker than the surfer he also is. He has a swimmer's long, sleek torso and a certain litheness about him. Chad is equally economical with his words, his movements, and his smiles. On my first visit to the bakery, I spent an hour watching him shape batards. He wore a white apron and tied tightly around his waist, a visor over his brown hair shaded his brown eyes. The process is mesmerizing to watch, but impossible to follow, to break down into discrete, comprehensible, imitatable steps. All I could make out was a blur of dexterous fingers that looked as if they were swaddling an endless succession of infants at warp speed. While he shaped loaves, we talked. I asked Chad about his starter. I had brought mine along in a Tupperware container, hoping to pick up some pointers on care and feeding, and, secretly, perhaps some good microbes as well, since I figured the bakery must be crawling with them. When I was starting out, Chad told me, I was superstitious about my starter, Chad said as he swiftly cut and weighed lumps of dough. I would take it on vacation with me because I didn't trust anyone with it. Once, I took it to the movies with me, so I could feed it exactly on time. But now that I've lost the starter and had to start it over a few times, I'm more relaxed about it. I now tend to think it's less about nature than nurture, meaning roughly that the requisite microbes are everywhere, but can be selected and trained by the baker to perform as he wants them to by how often you feed it and what temperature you keep it at. Chad showed me his culture, taking down from a high, warm shelf a metal bowl half filled with an animated white soup. It was wetter and warmer than mine and smelled less sour. He told a story about the night one of his apprentices, cleaning the bakery at the end of her shift, accidentally threw out the bowl of starter. I cried, he told me. I thought I was finished as a baker. But then I found I was able to start a new culture that within a couple of days smelled exactly like the old one. And smell is how you know whether you have a good starter. Chad judges a starter by its aroma, which in his view should be more fruity than vinegary. In fact, he doesn't like his sourdough to be very sour at all. Sour is easy to achieve, he told me. Just don't feed the starter as often. But it's one-dimensional. Chad, he's a very cerebral baker. Chad figures that by now the right yeasts and bacteria are all over his bakery and easy enough to capture. Though he also recently had experiences starting new cultures while in France and Mexico that soon came to smell and perform much like his culture in San Francisco. Of course, he could have been wearing those microbes on his fingers. This has led him to the conclusion that the feeding schedule and the ambient temperatures are the most important factors determining the character of a sourdough culture. But it could also be that by now, Chad Robertson carries some really good bugs on his person, which is why, before I left the bakery that evening, I opened my Tupperware to the Tartine air and asked him to pronounce on the quality of my culture. Chad raised the container to his nose, sniffed, and nodded in mild approval. And I think I collected the microbes I needed, because my starter got much better. The fourth transformation I deal with, and I'm going a little quickly because I'd love to answer your questions, is fermentation, but another kind of fermentation than bread. Bread still uses heat. There is a kind of cooking we do that uses no heat whatsoever, and it's, in a way, the most miraculous of all. And that is essentially using bacteria to transform our food, something that may go back as far as fire. We don't know where it starts. But amazing things happen when you allow foods to be transformed by bacteria. For one thing, they get much more interesting in their flavor. Funky, you might say, but more interesting than they were. For another, the process of fermentation preserves them. And remember, before refrigeration, we had really limited options in preserving food. And getting from one harvest to another was very, very difficult. But if you ferment vegetables, they will last for a very long time. How do you do it? It's really simple. You add salt, basically. Chop them up, add salt. Sometimes you have to add water, but many vegetables produce, like cabbage, produce enough of its own water. And what happens is you inaugurate this process of ecological succession. The microbes you need, the lactobacilli, are there already. And they're just everywhere. They're just lurking on the leaf of everything. They're on your skin. They're waiting for you to die so they can ferment you. But they're also on the cabbage, on the pickle, on everything. And so with a little salt, which they really like, and a sealed container, so it's anaerobic, they will get to work. And they will start chomping on the sugars in the vegetable and transforming them into lactic acid, which is the preservative. And as each one kind of pollutes its environment with lactic acid, makes it so acidic it can no longer live, another more acid-tolerant species takes over. And it goes on like a forest succession until you get to the kind of climax state of the fermented food. And there's one microbe, I forget the name right now, that loves a very acidic. And then it's done. But you can stop it at any point and put it in the refrigerator to halt the process. So I looked at fermentation of vegetables. I looked at fermentation of grain, which is beer, of course. And I had a really good time learning how to make beer. And then I worked with, and what I want to tell you about is someone who taught me how to make cheese, Sister Noella, who you may have heard of. There was a wonderful documentary that GBH did about her called The Cheese Nun. And she is a nun and cheesemaker and microbiologist from this area, in fact. And she lives in a convent or a abbey in Connecticut, not far from where I used to live. And she's making cheese on this abbey, which had cows and had a surplus of milk, the reason people always started making cheese, to preserve milk, essentially. She was visited by a woman from the Auvergne in France who taught her how to make Saint-Nectaire, which is a wash-rind cheese, beautiful cheese, and taught her absolutely the traditional way to do it, which is in a wooden barrel with raw milk and a wooden paddle. Now, any public health people in the audience will know that this sounds really dangerous. And the health department was really concerned about this because she's selling this cheese. And you cannot sanitize a wooden barrel. There are just too many nooks and crannies, not to mention the wooden paddle. But she knew that this was the key to making good cheese, was her wooden barrel. And so she set up a demonstration for the health inspector. And she got 2 vats of raw milk from her cows, put one in a stainless steel, that's the holy material for food safety, supposedly, in stainless steel, and the other in her vat, her wooden vat, and she introduced E. coli into both of them and waited 4 hours. And then they took tests. And the one in the steel vat at that point had lethal amounts of E. coli in it. I mean, it had just reproduced like crazy, and it would have been condemned in any, food safety operation. But oddly enough, in the wooden barrel, there was vanishingly low levels of E. coli. And what had happened is the lactobacillus that permanently live in that wood, and there's a white scum that's always there, all right? Part of the tradition is you rinse it out. You don't wash it with soap. And that those lactobacillus went to work on the milk, and as the name suggests, they digest lactose, and turned it into lactic acid, and that acid kills the E. coli. So the people in the Auvergne for hundreds of years were practicing a kind of folk microbiology that was keeping them safe, and they didn't really know why. Sister Noella went on to get a PhD in microbiology, and she consults with lots of cheesemakers now and helps defend them against food safety rules that have no rational basis, and there are quite a few of those. Anyway, I spent time with her, and one of the things I liked about Sister Noella is that she's a very earthy person, and she loves cheese, and she actually thinks that cheese should be introduced into the Catholic Eucharist. Well, think about it. You know, what's already there? They're both fermented, which is interesting and not surprising because it's about transcendence and transformation. But she felt that cheese is a better kind of reminder of mortality than wine or bread. I guess bread is what she'd substitute. And that cheese reminds us of death, and it gets riper and riper and riper. And as somebody said, at a certain age, it needs a room of its own. And we talked a lot about funkiness in cheese, which is not a subject you can really engage most people who are selling a product to the public about, and especially disgust, which is an element in food and in cheese. And so I mentioned this phrase to her that I'd read somewhere called the erotics of disgust. And she said, "Oh, I really like that term," Sister Noella said, when I raised as delicately as I could the issue of rankness in her cheese, because it's a pretty stinky cheese. The subject of disgust is not something I found many cheesemakers eager to discuss, at least not in the company of journalists. But Sister Noella is happy to talk about the earthier dimension of her work, at least up to a point. "Cheese is all about the dark side of life," she said one afternoon as we were strolling up the hill to her lab. She told me about a French cheesemaker of her acquaintance, a monk by the name of Frère Nathaniel, who makes a strong cheese called Tamier at his monastery in the Haute-Savoie. She once asked him how he determined when a Tamier is ripe. "You turn it over and sniff the bottom," Frère Nathaniel told her. "Ça sent la vache. It's ready when it smells like the cow." And then, in case that wasn't quite clear enough, he added, "the back end of the cow." It suddenly dawned on me, barnyardy, a term cheesemongers use in praise of certain stinky cheeses, is a euphemism for manure. Duh. Certainly the manure of some farm animals, such as cows, is not unappealing, at least when they've been out grazing on pasture. Yet some cheeses make even less socially acceptable illusions, if that's the right word. The various aromas of washed rind cheeses are often likened to those of the human body in its various parts. A French poet famously referred to the aroma of certain cheeses as pied de Dieu, the feet of God. That's a very curious thing to praise a cheese with. Just to be clear, foot odor of a particularly exalted quality, but still, foot odor. Sister Noella told me about another cheesemaker friend of hers, James Stillwagon, an American living in France who holds unusually frank views on the subject of cheese olfaction. She had recently quoted him at the end of the draft of an article on the microbiology of cheese rinds, though she wasn't sure if his remarks would survive editing. The quote came from an exchange the two had had on the question of why the vocabulary used to describe wine is so much richer and more nuanced than the vocabulary used to describe cheese. Wine talk is full of vivid metaphor, comparing wines to specific fruits and flowers, for example, where, as Stillwagon pointed out, the flavor of cheeses usually elicits only vague, generalized comments like, good, interesting, fantastic. And this is what he wrote. If we address frankly what is evoked by cheese, I think it becomes clear why so little is said. So what does cheese evoke? Damp, dark cellars, molds, mildews, and mushrooms galore, dirty laundry in high school locker rooms, digestive processes and visceral fermentations, he-goats which do not remind of Chanel. In sum, cheese reminds of dubious, even unsavory places, both in nature and in our own organisms, and yet we love it. In its very suggestiveness, cheese is both like and unlike many of the other foods humans cook or ferment. Whether by fire or water or the action of microbes, one of the ways humans transform the edible stuff of nature is in the direction of greater elusiveness, in taste or smell or appearance. And this happens when you're, cooking over a fire, too. You're creating all these new chemical compounds that remind us of things. And it's a troping of food, really, that goes on. And just as we take pleasure in enriching our language with layers of metaphor and allusion, we apparently like to trope what we eat and drink too, extracting from it not only more nourishment, but more meaning as well, more psychic nourishment, if you will. It just so happens that the more vivid, odoriferous tropes that cheesemakers have teased out of milk converge on the indecent, taking us places polite society doesn't want to go. But the question arises, why would we want to go there in the first place? Why don't cheesemakers stop with the sweet, freshly showered scent of mozzarella, rather than press on to the raw, ripe milk camembert with its suggestion of, well, negligent hygiene? Compared with some other mammals, we humans have long been alienated from our sense of smell. From the moment we began to walk upright, the eye took precedence over the nose. This at least is Sigmund Freud's theory for why humans have repressed so much of the sensory data supplied by the nose, and why our vocabulary for describing smells is comparatively so thin and generalized. The smells we are repressing are, of course, those of the lower body and the earth, which walking upright allows us to transcend, or at least overlook, in humanity's age-old project, a top priority project of putting space between itself and all the other animals. But that project has a cost. The reason those smells so transfix mammals that still walk on four legs is that they contain deeply compelling information. Information the high-minded biped is missing. Freud never said this, but Stillwagon might. A strong cheese puts us back on all fours. So that's cheese. I went much deeper into disgust, which I didn't expect to write about in a book about food. But the cool thing about cheese, though, is that pied de deux idea is the result of a bacteria in wash rind cheeses called B. linens, Brevibacterium linens, which turns out to be almost the same as the bacteria that lives between your toes. So is that an illusion? Or is there something more literal about that? It's a very weird idea. So anyway, it is 5 to 8. So I'm going to stop right here, and anyone who wants to ask a question about any of the foregoing or something else, please step up to the microphone. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I enjoyed the fermentation chapter the best in this book, but and I have a great pickle recipe from my father's Brooklyn pickles that I've been making for years. But I had a question about something from Omnivore's Dilemma about Polyface Farm.
Mm-hmm.
I was initially very impressed with Joel Salatin and his philosophy and the whole production and business of the farm. But then I went on the website and I saw something kind of upsetting. I don't know if I'm misinterpreting.
Tell me.
It's in his internship information, and it says, we're looking for clean-cut, all-American boy-girl appearance people. We are very, very discriminatory. And then you see a picture of all the white people that work there. I mean, is he really kind of a racist, or am I just reading too much into that?
I think Joel is in the process of, no, he's not a racist at all. In fact, he only began taking women interns within the last few years.
Yeah, I kind of got that sense, too, that it was boys first, yeah.
Joel is an evangelical Christian, and he shares some of the politics of that culture. Although he's much more on the libertarian side. He'll be voting for Rand Paul. Okay. I'm almost certain. I shouldn't speak for him. But it's interesting, as Joel has become more famous. This is the farmer that I profiled in Omnivore's Dilemma, who I think is one of the most innovative farmers. That he has, as he's gotten out in the world more and gotten around more, and he speaks, all over the place, I think his world is getting bigger and more tolerant in all sorts of ways.
Okay, that's nice to hear.
So,
thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm extremely passionate about cooking and the story behind food, so thank you for all your work, but also specifically for Cooked. It was an amazing book.
Thank you.
I just want to ask, so a lot of your other books had very concrete things that work for policy or work for community initiatives. Cooked was a little harder to turn into something like that, and I think it has value on its own, but I'm wondering any projects you know of or policy initiatives that can kind of help drive people towards cooking more?
Yeah, that's a great question. This book, if it has policy implications, they're subtle. And in a way, I wrote it out of a frustration with politics, I think. I mean, that we're not seeing a lot of movement from the Obama administration on food policy. And they are not going to protect us from the marketing of food corporations. And there's a lot of things they're not going to do, it appears now. And so we've got to act on our own because we can't wait. We have a public health crisis around food. We have Type 2 diabetes is 8% of the population, and it's expected to go to a third of the population for this generation just coming up. This is a disease that was never found in children until 1980, okay? And now it's rampant. So what do we do about it now while we wait for the wheels of government to change? Well, one thing we can do is cook. Can the government do things to help us cook? Yeah. I mean, a shorter work week would help. The objectives of the labor movement could help. Although I would point out, and I do in the book, that the American labor movement, as compared to the European labor movement, where cooking is still routine, although it's in trouble too, but they cook at much higher rates and have, as a result, less obesity and type 2 diabetes, their labor movement fought for time. That month-long vacation, shorter work week, shorter days. And our labor movement tended to fight for money and gave up time. And I think that's part of the trade-off we've made as a society, and it's one of the issues I think we need to re-examine. I think bringing back home ec would be a fantastic policy solution. I mean, we need to teach our kids how to cook, and if we don't know how to do it ourselves, then the schools need to help do it, as they once did. Although in those days, of course, it was gendered, as they say. Almost all the people taking home ec were girls, and the boys took shop. And I learned how to make a Japanese lantern, which hasn't really served me very well, and girls learned how to saute and roast and things like that. So we need a non-sexist home ec. And also one that's not infiltrated by the food industry, because toward the end of home ec, they were turning it into a microwave class by giving, curricular materials that were really designed to sell processed food. So that's where I would focus. I would focus on the schools. And there's so much we can do there. But thank you for your good question.
Thank you.
Hi. So I'm curious, you talked a lot about your mentorships and apprenticeships. And I'm curious how you went about getting those and your process through those and how you learned through them and maybe how you would recommend going about those, especially if you don't have a big book deal behind it.
Well, it's one of the challenges journalists always face, and I faced before anyone knew who I was. And indeed, being well known sometimes makes it harder to get certain places. I have more trouble getting into Monsanto, for example, than I don't know why. I can get into a bakery, though. So we each have, paths that are a little easier. I think flattery will get you everywhere when you're talking about mentorships, and that if you have really done the research and identified this person as a master of their craft, people are very happy to hear that. And I think one of the challenges and I teach journalism at Berkeley and I tell my students this, don't ask for the world the first time. Don't say, I want to come to your bakery and hang out for a week. People are going to say no. You start with an interview, then you say, can I come for a few hours? Then you say, can you recommend a hotel in your area? And they get the idea that, so you have to insinuate yourself, because it sounds like way too much work to have someone in your face for days and days and days. So gradualism is really, really important. But flattery is very important too.
Thank you.
Sure.
If you want to touch on your gluten thoughts, I think people would find that interesting as well.
Oh, sure. Okay. How many people are gluten intolerant? Wow, less than, you have such good bread in Cambridge that the epidemic has been held off. Well, it's curious that so many people identify as gluten intolerant, and in fact, there are more people who are gluten intolerant, but there are many more who think they are or want to be. And the reason you might want to be is it's such a simple solution to all your life problems. If this one substance is what's getting you into trouble. I don't want to demean people who really struggle with gluten. It is a hard thing to digest. It is a protein or two proteins, which is supposedly very good for you. And why would it be more of a problem? And in fact, we know the incidence of celiac disease, which is the kind of extreme version of it. I don't know how this guy got two questions, but okay. He's a future journalist. Where was I? So what would be causing, celiac disease has doubled from 1% to 2%. It's still very tiny, but if you go back and you look at blood serum saved from 50 years ago, you will find less antibodies than you do now. So what happened? Well, there's a few theories, and no one knows for sure. One is we make bread in a very different way. We're exposed to gluten in a different way. We no longer do the long sourdough fermentation. And there is some interesting Italian research that suggests if you properly ferment bread for like 14 or 20 hours, you can digest it without a problem, and that the long fermentation breaks down the peptides on the gluten. That's one theory. So the way we leaven bread, I went to a Wonder Bread factory in the book, and they kind of leaven bread in like an hour. They just shoot it full of yeast and other stuff, and just boom. And so the transformations of fermentation don't happen. And gluten is also showing up in all these other foods as a filler and stretcher. And it's very hard to find a tortilla without gluten in it now, because they don't break when you fold them. So this is considered so valuable that we're corrupting our tortillas with gluten. So the other is, though, that our microbiome is disordered. Our immune system is generally screwed up these days. And our bodies, we have higher rates of all kinds of allergies and asthma. And this may owe to one of two things. One is the Western diet has compromised the health of this ecosystem that lives in your large intestine. Is very important to your health. And when the lining of your digestive system is inflamed, which fast food does instantly, okay? Sugar does instantly. It lets big molecules into the bloodstream that shouldn't get there, and they excite an immune reaction. And even big molecules like gluten are getting out in people who fundamentally don't have a healthy gut. The other is, though, that we just weren't exposed to enough bacteria as children. And kids who grow up on farms have none of these problems because they're exposed to so much bacteria, even in utero, and it makes a huge difference. So their immune systems can recognize friend and foe. So it's something is going on, but it's also a marketing thing, and it's a bit of a social contagion. If your friend says that, you know, she's sleeping better and happier and sex is better, and since she got off gluten, you're going to try it, and the power of suggestion is powerful. So, your question, please.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. I was really interested in what you were saying about cheese becoming sort of a literary trope, and how fermentation is a sort of a metaphorical sort of system. And I'm just wondering, excuse me for this simplistic question, but do you have a favorite literary depiction of food or cooking? Anything that sort of inspired you or struck you in a certain way? You know,
the question is, do I have a favorite literary depiction of food? I don't know that I do. There's a movie I love, Babette's Feast, which is a wonderful movie about food. Yeah. There's a book I came across, though, that I loved, that I recommend, that people don't seem to know about. You know, we all know about The Physiology of Taste by Brillat-Savarin, and everybody celebrates this book. It's the first work of gastronomy. And it's charming, but it's completely wrong scientifically. It has so many bogus theories. But there was another book written a few years later by Baron Rumohr, R-U-M-O-H-R. He's a German who wrote a book it's called The Essence of Cookery. And it is in print. It's a little hard to find. And it's wonderful, and it's full of like really good information, and beautifully written. But I think because it's a German writing about food, nobody thinks it could possibly be any good. But he's a very wise guy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned earlier about how some of the technologies...
Will you tilt the microphone up so we can hear you a little better?
Sorry. Some of the innovations in food preparation that allowed early humans to make things a lot more quickly was really great, but clearly you see a line between those sorts of innovations and the one that allow us to eat really quickly now. And this is all to say, if you could maybe talk about Soylent or other products like that allow you to replace food entirely. Yeah, okay. Well, it's true that for most, and this is one of the mysteries that I'm trying to unravel in the book, for most of human history, we processed food, whether it was with fire or bacteria or water, in ways that made it more nutritious, more delicious, and generally were boons to mankind. And yet now we think of processed food as exactly the wrong thing. So where did we go wrong? And there is a moment that I cite in the book where the history of food processing took a wrong turn. And that was in the 1880s, 70s and 80s in England, where we invented the roller mill to refine white flour, to completely get all the nutritious bits of the wheat seed out of the flour. And this was considered a great boon because white flour was very prestigious and it was easy to digest.
And suddenly we were processing in a crazy way that was leading to all sorts of nutritional deficiencies. And people got sick as soon as we had white flour. And years later, we figured out we had taken out all the vitamins, so we started making Wonder Bread to put them back in. And then it was a great new product. But essentially, we were trying to undo the damage we had done. That's the moment, and that's when you see us. That's the first modern industrial processed food that leads to health problems and becomes the model. It's the model because it made the food last longer. Suddenly, the insects and bacteria weren't interested in flour, and it didn't go bad. Gee, maybe that should tell us something. Maybe they know something about nutrition. So they lost interest, but it meant that you could keep it on the shelf forever, and that was very desirable. So I talk a lot about that turning point in the bread chapter, but that is where I think we went wrong. Now the question is, could we go right again? Are there things food science can do? Soylent, which some of you probably read about in the New Yorker last week, is not really a new idea. The supermarket shelves are full of food replacements, nutriment, and all this kind of stuff. And, if you've watched your grandparents in the hospital near death, they're getting something like that right into their stomach. It's not a beautiful thing. But there's some people in Silicon Valley who are looking for a replacement for food because they're so busy. Pleasure doesn't seem to enter into it. So the problem with Soylent, and it's the same problem with infant formula, we don't know enough about nutrition to say what you need. We can keep you alive, but we can't keep you healthy. And if you look at the history of infant formula, it's one missed nutrient after another. And we still can't make infant formula that is as good for babies as mother's milk. The most recent discovery, we thought we had the vitamins right, and we had the proportion of fats, different kinds of fats, and carbohydrates and protein, but still babies didn't thrive on it. And then they learned that there was something called oligosaccharides, a kind of sugar that represents 40% of the calories or the sugars, I forget, in milk, in mother's milk. And it was a mystery because the babies can't digest oligosaccharides. They don't have the enzyme. So what was it doing there? They didn't bother putting it in formula. Well, it turns out it was there to feed a certain microbe that babies need in their guts to be healthy, bifidobacteria. So that mother's milk is so beautifully designed, not just to feed you, but this ecosystem you depend on, and seed it properly with the right kinds of microbes. So what else have we left out? So the idea that this guy ordering online and looking up USDA charts on necessary nutrients has nailed food, I think is really unlikely.
Thank you very much.
And we have time for 2 more quick questions.
Okay. I'll try to be quick in my answers.
Hi. So I am a teacher in schools. And I think that what you mentioned about how in previous history, rich people were the people who were able to choose not to cook. I feel what I've seen a lot in many of my students is that now it's flipped, and the poorest people are not able to choose to cook. Yeah. And you mentioned a little bit about pushing towards the schools and that being the best way for pushing towards that policy and that change. Is that really fundamentally how we can get to that quickest? Is that what's going to be healthiest for and most equitable for our country?
Yeah. Well, look, the issue of class and food is really behind your question, and it's really, really important. Schools are one of the great democratic institutions we have. If you want to reach everyone, as the school lunch program did reach everybody and improve the nutrition of millions of people who are really hungry, and now with breakfast does even more. The cooking, if you're poor, is, if anything, more important, but it is also a problem because of time. Many people who are poor are working a couple jobs, and time is really the limiting factor. In order to be able to cook, you do need to be able to invest either money to buy ingredients that don't need a lot of preparation, like high-quality meat and things, or time. And some people don't have either. But I do think that we all can find more time than we're giving it now, and that cooking is very economical. I don't think people realize there's this assumption that processed food is cheaper than home-cooked food, and that is not true. To eat healthy, you don't need to buy organic, you don't need to buy local, you just need to buy real food, raw ingredients, the stuff, lining the peripheries of the store, and know a few things about how to combine them. There are a great many things you can make in less than 30 minutes. And so I think we have to make this information available to people. I've talked a lot to activists who work on food access, how to get fresh food into the inner city, and I met a man in Chicago who'd set up this beautiful bus to be a little farmer's market, and he drives it into the rougher neighborhoods in Chicago, and he said at a certain point, but I come back and it's, you know, it's almost full. And I said, why do you think? It wasn't price, he was selling it, you know, cheaper than supermarket. He said people didn't know what to do with it. He said, I need a second bus with a cooking classroom that follows the first bus. So I think we need to make this cultural information available to people. And I think that obviously people need a little more time in the day to do it. But the main thing is if you share the work and you get kids into the kitchen and you get your partner into the kitchen is when it becomes a whole lot easier and possible to make time. But your question is very much on my mind, and if there are policy solutions to it, you know, I'm really interested in hearing about them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, thank you for taking us on a voyage across the world and back in time.
Thank you.
So you quickly mentioned the sacred at the beginning of your speech, and you know, with the 4 factors in your book, air, fire, water, and earth, would you consider writing a book about agriculture and, you know, following those 4 things?
On the farm?
Yes.
Well, I sort of feel like I have written a book about agriculture, and that in Omnivore's Dilemma was really where I explored farming, and actually in Second Nature, my very first book, which is about gardening, where I really look closely at the engagements with nature that happen on a farm. There's probably more to say, but it's not in my immediate plans to write more about agriculture.
Thank
But
you.
thank you for your good question. Thank you all for your questions. Yeah.